All right, everybody. I'm really pleased and excited to welcome my good friend, Frank Turek. You guys know him pretty well. He's been on my channel a few times before. I invited him on to talk about a few things because, as you guys know, I've kind of been on this journey trying to understand gender ideology, critical race theory, all these things that have really come on the scene in the last about 6-7 years or so. And I've been on a journey trying to really understand how we got here. And it just so happened that in my class for Southern Evangelical Seminary, I had to write a paper about political philosophy. And I ended up stumbling upon one of Frank's books that he wrote with the great Norman Geisler called Legislating Morality. And I ended up writing my paper on this book, and it blew me away. And I also read Carl Trueman's book, as some of you know, and I am now reading Cynical Theories. I'm just really trying to grasp these ideas and understand how we got here. So in light of that, I thought it would be a great idea to ask Frank to come on and talk about some of these things that might help connect a few dots for us. And Frank, thank you so much again for coming onto my channel.
Oh, well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Melissa. This is the first book I ever wrote. And it was a book that really came out of a sermon that Dr. Geisler gave in 1992. Yeah, maybe it was 1993. Anyway, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
We'd moved to Charlotte to go to the seminary, SES, and he was preaching one Sunday morning about how all laws legislate morality. And I went, what? I always thought you couldn't legislate morality. And one after one, the myths surrounding this topic, he dispensed with in a sermon. And I finally went up to him, I said, that needs to be a book. He said, let's write it. So that's how it happened. By 1998, we had a book. So
yes, and I before we got on, I remember telling you I didn't know you were a prophet. I mean, I'm reading this book. It was written, I think the first edition 1998, and then maybe reprinted in like 2003.
That's right.
So,
yeah, you have the 2003 edition. Here's the original. This is what
okay,
like.
Good. I the reason why I know that is because Turabian style citations. I mean, you got to know the year.
That's right.
I was writing the paper, and I did not realize that I was reading basically about the moral law.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear this all the time, like, you can't legislate morality. And I'm like, what does that even mean?
That's right.
I had the same question you did. I did not realize that this was your first book. And the ideas in here, just that it was amazing, because what it helped me to do was to grasp that the fact that when there's an appeal to the moral law, all of a sudden, when you do away with that, we're the law. And it's really helping me understand why we are where we're at. Now, with that being said, it's so hard to discuss everything in this book, not even the book, just these ideas that are in our culture and how we got here. But there are three main things that I actually wanted to ask you about, and just kind of throw it at you and get your opinion on this, because these are things that we're seeing not just in the culture, but in the church as well. And I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this. First is something that's kind of a growing trend within the church, and it's called theonomy. And this is something that I've been learning about, and I just heard about it maybe last year as a position that a lot of Christians are taking. And first, I would like you, number one, to explain what theonomy is, and number two, why it's wrong.
Well, theonomy is the idea that we ought to legislate religion rather than just legislating morality. See, there's this easy for me to say. There's a distinction. That interview is just getting started, and I can't even put it.
Don't worry, you're doing good, Frank.
There's a distinction between religion and morality. Religion involves our duty to God. Morality involves our duty to one another. Now, they are related, but you can legislate morality without legislating religion. We don't and shouldn't be telling people where, when, how, or if to worship or to obey certain rites and rituals. That would be legislating religion. But we can't avoid telling people how to treat one another. That's what all laws do. That's legislating morality. So in the book, Legislating Morality, we draw the distinction between legislating religion and legislating morality. The founders of our country did not want to legislate religion. They had no religious test to be a member of government or to be someone who was a citizen of the United States. In fact, sometimes you get the question, Melissa, is or was America a Christian nation? And the way you answer that is by asking, do you mean prescriptively or descriptively? Prescriptively, no. There was no prescription at the federal level to be a Christian, to be in government, or to be a citizen. Interestingly enough, there were prescriptions in the state governments, that in the state constitutions, you had to be a Christian to serve in government. Now, that isn't enforced anymore, but if you look at state constitutions, you will see that they actually required you to be some sort of Christian in order to be in the government. All right. So we don't legislate religion, but we do legislate morality. And what Thomas Jefferson and his founders, his co-founders wanted to do in our nation is they didn't want to have the intolerance of establishing a state church. They just came from that in England. But on the other hand, they didn't want to have a free-for-all where they would have no moral standard by which to say people had certain rights. Mm-hmm. So what Jefferson did is he picked the perfect middle alternative between establishing religion and just a human non-standard or no standard kind of free-for-all. He didn't want to have anarchy, but he didn't want to have religion either. So he had the perfect middle alternative, which is we are going to legislate the natural law, the moral law, the law written on our hearts that Paul says in Romans chapter 2. So that way you could have God-given moral rights without the intolerance of a sectarian religion. And you wouldn't have just the whims of just a human being saying, well, I think this is right. No, I think this is right. You would still have a standard that came from the same source as the Bible, God, but you didn't have to be religious in order to believe that standard, and you didn't have to be religious in order to be a member of the United States. So the United States was descriptively Christian, but not prescriptively Christian. Most people were Christians, and most people believed in the moral law and tried to live that way. So we don't want to legislate religion. That's theonomy. That would be like saying, let's throw the Bible at people. Let's say they got to obey all the Old Testament laws. First of all, that would be impossible because there's no temple. You couldn't obey all the Old Testament laws if you wanted to. And secondly, it's not desirable. And thirdly, the Bible does not command it. The Old Testament laws were just for Israel. The ones that are repeated in the New Testament are for everyone. So we shouldn't be trying to legislate the Bible. We should legislate principles consistent with the Bible, and that's what the moral law is. And that's what the whole book is premised on, that we are legislating morality, but we're not legislating religion.
Yes, and it's interesting because I homeschool now, and one of the things that my 12-year-old, what we're going over right now is the Constitution in the curriculum. And there are many videos that I've shown her, but this conversation right here, she really understood the uniqueness, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence, that there wasn't an appeal to religion and there wasn't an appeal to secularism. It was it was the moral law. And there was something about that she really understood. And so that makes a lot of sense when it comes to that as well. Now, you mentioned not legislating the Bible. A lot of people that are in this group of theonomy that says, yes, we should follow these rules and follow these laws and we should enforce them. I think, let me know what you think about this, but one thing that I think that they might be missing about this is that I think that takes away the freedom to choose when it comes to following God and believing God. And it wouldn't really be any different than, say a Islamic country forcing them to believe a religion. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we have to be clear that many of the principles we will legislate from the moral law are consistent with the Bible. Yes. Because they come from the same source. The moral law comes from God, just like the Bible does. But when we say in our laws, thou shalt not steal, we're legislating that not because it's part of the 10 Commandments. We're legislating that because it's part of the natural law, the moral law that does come from God. You just don't even need the Bible to know it, and you don't need to be a Christian to know it. Yes. Okay? So that's the key distinction we need to make. And Psalm 147 says God gave his laws only to Israel. He gave it to no other nation. also the idea that the old covenant has passed away and is obsolete. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 8:13. So the old covenant and all those Old Testament laws, anywhere from Exodus 20 through Deuteronomy, those laws were just for ancient Israel. Now, again, I have to be clear here and point this out, that many of those laws are universal and are repeated in the New Testament and do apply to everyone, like thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal. But that's because they're part of the moral law that God has given to everybody. The law that is found in the Old Testament was just given to Israel. In fact, I know our friend Greg Kokel puts it this way. I think it's a good illustration. You live in New Mexico. I live in Charlotte, right? Mm-hmm. I am not bound by the laws of New Mexico, and you're not bound by the laws of North Carolina, right? Because we live in different states. However, both New Mexico and North Carolina have similar laws. So thou shalt not murder is a law in North Carolina, just like it is in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But when I'm in North Carolina, if I were to commit murder, I wouldn't be brought up on charges of murder in New Mexico. I would be brought up on charges of murder in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. They're two different jurisdictions, and there are two different laws, even though they're very similar. Mm-hmm. So in the Old Testament, thou shalt not murder is part of the Old Covenant for Israel. We're not under that jurisdiction. But thou shalt not murder is still a law from the New Covenant, and we are under that jurisdiction. It also comes from the moral law that God has given us. So this is where some of the confusion comes in. People think, well, we have to legislate the Bible in order to have a moral society. No, we are legislating principles consistent with the Bible, but we are really legislating the moral law that comes from the same source as the Bible, and that is God. It allows for religious freedom. It's not saying you have to be Christian. It's not saying you have to do certain rites and rituals. It's saying you have to treat people fairly, and that's what we legislate in our laws.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, the other end of this is, so we have theonomy, which would be considered kind of for some, a extremist view for mm-hmm. Christianity. And then you have the other end of the pendulum, mm-hmm. which is humanism, mm-hmm. where there's no God, which mm-hmm. I arguably say that's really where we have been heading mm-hmm. In the last, since the 60s, I would say, maybe even before that. Now, what is humanism and why is that wrong?
Well, humanism is the idea that there is no standard beyond us, that human beings just make up what's right and wrong according to what they think they want to do. There's no moral standard. Mm-hmm. I'm looking for in our book where we have, here is the official statement of secular humanists. This came at a couple of points. It came back in the 30s, I think, and also in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. And humanists stated this in Humanist Manifesto 1, to establish such a religion of humanism, they called it a religion, actually, Melissa, mm-hmm. which is interesting, is a major necessity of the present. It is a responsibility that rests upon this generation. We therefore affirm the following. Here's basically the 10 commandments of humanism. Okay, it's not 10, there's just a few of them. I'm mentioning a few of them. First, religious humanists must regard the universe as self-existing and not created, even though we know that's not the case, that the universe was created. Secondly, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he's emerged as a result of a continuous process. So evolution, we're just part of nature. We're no different than the dogs or the cats or the other animals out there. Another premise. Fifth, humanism asserts that nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantee of human values. Basically, that's relativism. There's no cosmic guarantee. You don't have human value. I don't have human value, or these human values aren't objective. They don't come from a source beyond us, is what they're saying, which means that it's relativism. It's a free-for-all. Whoever has the most power wins. Look, there's two ways you can govern. You can govern by principle, or you can govern by power. In other words, you can govern by what's right, or you can just govern by getting a lot of power and forcing your will on other people. And that's what we see in cancel culture, right? Yes. It's not principled. It's just, you don't agree with me, I'm going to shut you up. I'm going to shut you down. You don't have any rights. You're not going to be able to speak. You're not going to be able to do what you want to do because I'm going to cancel you. That's government by power. where we need to govern by principle. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal and endowed by their creator, not by their government, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson goes on to say that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, government doesn't give you rights. If that were the case, rights would be arbitrary because a new government could come in and take them away. When rights by definition are something you have regardless of what anyone else says about them, right? So government just secures rights. Jefferson said, look, if the government doesn't do that, the people have the right to get a new government. And that's what the Declaration of Independence is all about, to get a new government. Because King George was not actually honoring the rights of the colonists. So the colonists said, look, we need a new government. You're not doing it, George. You're not protecting innocent people from evil. In fact, you're doing evil. You're legislating immorality rather than morality.
Yes. Yeah. And that's interesting that you put it that way, because there's a section that I read about the fact that you have to legislate morality. It's not the point that it's legislated. The question is, whose morality?
Exactly.
Right. If morality is fluid, and kind of it's exactly what we're seeing right now. I mean, I think it was a year or so ago, there was something that Biden put into law about the transgender ideology in schools, to protect them. And there's this whole pull towards this ideology. But what I don't think people understand, and this is my biggest aha moment from this, is this has been coming for a while. This has been coming since Rousseau, right? Like these philosophers, and has been growing over time. And it's been a long time coming. And for somebody like me, it seems brand new on the scene. But in reality, this has been something that's been going on. And you have people like you and Geisler who have seen this and have kind of, I call it like prophetically almost, but you just followed the pattern to show that this is the end game. We will go this way if we don't stop. We have to appeal to this. And the problem is that people don't like the standard of morality, so they make their own, which brings me to my third question. Now, we have theonomy, which we briefly talked about. We have humanism, which we briefly talked about. And there's a third option, though, that we find that our Constitution and our government was based upon, which is the moral law, the natural law that you mentioned earlier. Now, why is this superior to either one of these?
Well, because as Jefferson realized, and his other co-founders, that the moral law gives everyone God-given rights, but not at the expense of religious freedom. You don't have to be a Christian to have the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to speech and religion, and these other rights that the Constitution talks about. You already have them because God has given you those rights. So you don't have to be a Christian. You can be an atheist and you still have all the same rights as anybody else. Whereas in England, where they came from, they had a state church, and they felt that state church was oppressive. It didn't allow for religious freedom. So you get the benefits of having God without the religious intolerance that some people may have who are religious. So this experiment we call, and some call it American exceptionalism, not the fact that the people are exceptional, but the founding documents are exceptional. There's no other government like this. We take it for granted we have these rights. But around the world, they have these rights. They're just not enshrined in their government, right? Everybody has these rights that we have here in America, but they don't have them protected by their government. Now, we're seeing that erode here in the United States because we've gotten away from the moral law. In fact, I know this is going to sound weird. You're not old enough to remember this, but in 1990, I want to say 92 or 91, somewhere in there, Clarence Thomas came up to be on the Supreme Court. And during his confirmation hearings, one senator on the Judiciary Committee that had to affirm Clarence Thomas was somebody by the name of Joe Biden. You may have heard that name. And he was trying to excoriate Clarence Thomas because Clarence Thomas believed in natural law. When in fact, The truth is, our government was founded on natural law. That's what the Declaration of Independence is all about.
Yeah.
So Joe Biden wasn't very smart back then either. Okay. I mean, here he is excoriating a man who has been nominated to the Supreme Court for believing in the foundation of our country. So without natural law, by the way, there would be no way to adjudicate, say, our government from the Nazi government. Mm-hmm. Why would we say that the Allies were right in World War II and the Nazis weren't? If there's no standard beyond governments, then there would be no way to say that the Allies are closer to the standard of righteousness than are the Nazis. Mm-hmm. This is why C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity famously says, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas is better than another, you are in fact comparing them to another standard, something outside the two people or the two groups that you're trying to compare. You're trying to say it's a standard outside. That standard outside is God's nature. If there is no standard outside of humanity, then everything's just a matter of opinion. The Nazis, just a matter of opinion. Mother Teresa versus Hitler, just a matter of opinion. And when we get away from recognizing that God is the standard, we get the kind of chaos we're starting to see in our culture now. And by the way, Geisler and Turek weren't prophets. I mean, Nietzsche knew this. Nietzsche knew this. I mean, he died in 1900 and he was an atheist. And he basically said, if we kill belief in God, if God dies, man dies. And he was right. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. Yes. Because we got rid of God. Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident, was famous for saying, after so many millions of his countrymen were murdered, he said, someone asked him, why did this happen? And he basically just said, because we have forgotten God. That's why. We've forgotten God. We've forgotten the ultimate standard of goodness, righteousness. We've forgotten justice. We've forgotten all that stuff because we are now the measure. Human beings make these decisions. We're not looking to a standard beyond ourselves. We are the standard. Well, that's dangerous. That's tyranny. That's how tyrants arise. They are the standard. There's no standard beyond them.
Yes, and it sounds selfish of me to say this, but I took it for granted. You know, I mean, I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, and it wasn't on my mind to think that, oh, wow, you know, America's wonderful. And I always knew that. But when it's in your face like this and you start seeing the postmodern grip of what is happening in our country, and you see that where the moral law is done away with and it's now a human standard, all of a sudden you start seeing the implications of that. And I now have kids, you know, so it's like you start thinking about the country that they're growing up in and you start caring more about this. And so there's a level there of making sense of the past to understand where we're going. And you're absolutely right. There is something that Carl Trueman calls in his book called expressive individualism. And there's this emphasis on the authenticity of a person that takes precedent over reality, right? So how a person identifies inside and how they actually feel is what they correspond to reality. It doesn't actually correspond to actual reality. And where I never thought I would see this is in the government, where laws are now being made that make us deny reality in order to appease somebody else's feelings.
As we think about that, Melissa, notice, as you mentioned before, that's a moral position as well. Now, in other words, if somebody says that you need to call me by my pronouns, or we're going to fine you, or you're going to go to jail, or you know, I have a right to use whatever bathroom I want to use. That's an argument from a moral position. It's basically saying that I have this right, and I'm taking away any right you have. Any freedom you have, because my right overpowers your right. That's a moral position. So my question is, when people bring this stuff up, well, by what standard are you saying you have these rights? If there's no God, there's no right to same-sex marriage. There's not even right to natural marriage. It's just your opinion. If there's no God, there's no right to transgenderism, or there's no right to say, no, I won't comply with transgender ideology. There's no right to anything if there's no God. It's just one person's opinion against another person's opinion. So no matter which side of the political aisle you're on, you're trying to impose a moral point of view. The only question is, where are you getting this moral standard from by which you ought to impose this moral point of view? What is the standard? Where does it come from? And is it the right standard? Mm-hmm. That's the real issue. By the way, obviously, pro-lifers want to impose continued pregnancy on the mother. What do pro-abortion people want to do? They want to impose death on the baby whenever abortion is chosen. They also want to impose on the father or society at large, and even the child, that they don't have any rights. The father has no rights to say, don't kill my child. The state has no right to say, don't kill the child. And obviously, the child has no right to say, don't kill me. That's a moral position that the pro-abortion people are arguing. So my question is it more severe to kill somebody than it is just to require somebody remain pregnant? Mm-hmm. I think it's obviously more severe to kill someone. So when rights conflict, because generally a woman does have a right to control her own body, but just not if she kills another body in the process, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so in this case, I would say that the baby's right to life supersedes a mother's right to end her pregnancy, mm-hmm. because life is more important than liberty in that regard, because the right to life is the right to all other rights. If you don't have life, you don't have anything. So that's the primary right we have. Everything else flows from it. If you don't have life, you don't have rights. You're not alive, so you can't have any other rights.
It reminds me of another book that we read in seminary, an ethics book that Norman Geisler wrote. And he brings up a similar position. Like, what's the higher moral thing to do? It was a fascinating thing. He basically echoed a lot of what you just said on what is the morally right thing to do. What's the ethically right thing to do in this case?
Yeah, I'm actually echoing what he said. Okay?
Yeah, that's true.
He didn't learn it from me. I learned it from him.
That's true.
Yeah, it's this book, Christian Ethics, which is still a classic. This is
that's the one. That's the one we got to read.
It's kind of a newer cover because it used to be a red cover. But
great book.
There's a hierarchy of values.
Yes.
Right? There's a hierarchy of values. And so obviously the right to life is at the top, and then other rights come after that. And if we lose that hierarchy, and we point this out in legislating morality, if we lose that hierarchy, then we're going to legislate immorally. We have to legislate according to the hierarchy.
Yeah. Now, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about this. I have one last question to kind of wrap it all up. What do you think we can do as Christians, to prepare ourselves for where our country is going, number one, and where do you think the country is going?
Well, the first thing we ought to do is be salt and light, and that means being involved everywhere, not only in our church, but in our communities, in politics, in business, in education, in media, everywhere. I know a lot of Christians seem to have an allergy to being involved in politics, and I always ask them two questions. The first question is, do you think Christians should care how other people are treated? Everyone's going to say yes, right? In fact, you don't even have to be a Christian to care how other people are being treated, right? So the second question is, do you think Christians should care how their government treats people? Well, yes, of course. So that means you have to be involved politically. And you have to be involved politically if for no other reason to protect your ability to preach and live the gospel. Because politics affects our ability to preach and live the gospel. We can't have the Melissa Dougherty show in China right now. We can't. Or North Korea, or Iran, or Saudi Arabia. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. You can't have a church in Saudi Arabia. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. We just take it for granted we have religious freedom, don't we?
Yeah.
But most countries, or at least a lot of countries, don't have it. And we're losing it here because there are other ideologies that are arising, like transgenderism and LGBTQ stuff, that are threatening to overpower your religious freedom. You're not going to be able to live and preach the gospel if that trend continues. So where is our country going? I don't know where it's going to wind up ultimately. If I had to guess, at some point, one of the states is going to secede. Now that's going to create a whole big financial problem in one regard, because, okay, what currency do you use? What about debt? What about Social Security? What about all of those considerations you're going to have to somehow take care of and think about? But this country's not going to last forever. It's going to implode from within, probably more so than it's going to be taken over from without. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire.
I literally was just thinking of that, Frank.
Yeah.
Literally, as you were saying it, because we had to write a paper on that in college about how the Roman Empire fell. And I took this class 2004. And I remember the teacher at that time, who's not a Christian, this was a secular college. And she's all, you watch. She's like, here's these 5 things, and it was the morality was number 1. She's like, if you do away with morality, your society will fall. And again, she was not a Christian by any sense or stretch of the imagination. And she started talking about population, immigration, all the things. And it's so funny that you mentioned that, because that's exactly the parallel that she was trying to make.
Yeah, it may have been from Edwin Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he was an anti-Christian guy. But he even admitted that the nuclear family, once that goes away, morality goes away. You have an over interest in sex, right? The sexual ethic goes away. I mean, the reason a country is strong is because at its foundation, it's strong. So if you have strong biological families that stay together, then you can have a civilized society. But if you break down the biological 2-parent family, then you tend to get chaos. And that's where we're heading now. So tragically, that's where we're heading. But that doesn't mean Christians ought to give up. Christians still ought to be salt and light and do what's right, regardless of what you think the consequences are. Just do what's right and leave the results to God. In fact, if the church actually participated properly politically and voted properly, most of our political problems would be over. The reason the country's going the wrong way is not because the liberals have taken over. It's because the church has seceded ground. In fact, one point I make about same-sex marriage, it wasn't the LGBTQ activists that gave us same-sex marriage. They had something to do with it. But the reason same-sex marriage was eventually passed through the Supreme Court, not through the people, was because Christians years ago bought into the romantic view of marriage. That marriage is all about romantic feelings. And once you lose that romantic feeling, you have the right to move on to someone else. That's where no-fault divorce came in. No-fault divorce spread across the country and made it so easy to get a divorce under the well-intended principle that some people are in abusive marriages, so they have to get out of them. The problem is they made it so easy, and marriage became more about your emotional connection to the other person rather than any commitment you have to that person or to children, that people could get out of marriages so easily. Well, if marriage is just about an emotional connection to one other person, why can't 2 same-sex people do that? If it's just about emotions and not really about commitment to children, then why shouldn't we have same-sex marriage? So it's really the Christians that paved the way for same-sex marriage by what Carl Truman would say, this, how did he put it? Individualism? What's his word?
Expressive individualism.
Expressive individualism, yeah. It's expressive individualism. I just have to be me. I have to be me. Well, if I have to be
my authentic self, Frank. This is really who I am.
You know, our authentic selves are selfish and evil. So if we allow our authentic selves to go on unrestrained, we're not going to have civilization. We're going to have chaos. That's the problem.
And this is so good for us to know right now. I think this is a topic that every Christian needs to look into. Every book that we mentioned in this video, guys, I'm going to leave in the description below. I highly recommend getting your hands on them, because there's been a lot of dots connected for me. And I know if it's done for me, I know it's going to be connected for a lot of you guys. I hope this video has helped you, maybe given you a starting point to understand certain things and see certain things. Frank, I just love talking to you, and I appreciate you again coming on, taking the time to talk with me about this. I'd love to have you back on again sometime.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. It's always great being with you. And I see your YouTube channel is growing. And I'm looking forward to
Yes.
seeing you in Albuquerque because, ladies and gentlemen, those of you watching, we're doing the Cross Examine Instructor Academy, and Melissa will be a part of that. It's in July
Mhm.
in Albuquerque. So you guys go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You'll see CIA if you want to be a part of it. Check it out.
I'm excited for that. I cannot wait. That's at the end of July. So hopefully we'll see you guys there. Again, link in the description to that as well, because you guys do that every year. So that link will be live for a while.
That's right.
So, but yeah, thank you again. And I appreciate it.